Here is a video on solving polynomial equations by factoring. So I believe all of these are going to be quadratic equations, but just so you know, in general, if we have a polynomial of any sort that it is possible to factor, then that is going to be the easiest or fastest method. So in my class, we've already done solving quadratic equations by the quadratic formula and graphing and things like that. And so those methods are actually longer and take more effort than it would take to just be able to factor, at least for the most part. So this is this is a great tool to be able to use if you're trying to solve polynomial equations. So the idea, if we look here where I've already got something that's factored, this would have been 2x squared plus something, or minus something, but it's already factored for us, so we don't have to worry about that step. The idea here is if I have two things that I'm trying to multiply together that have to equal 0, then one of these two things has to be 0. So think about it. If you know that you have two numbers that when you multiply them together that they're 0, either you have 0 times something else, you could have something else times 0, or you could have 0 times 0. So what that means is that our answers to this, x equals whatever it takes to make each of these parentheses 0. And there's a really easy way to do that, is you take each parentheses, or each thing that we're multiplying by, and we set them equal to 0 and we solve. So for instance, on this first one, we subtract 5 from both sides and get x equals -5. That's what makes this first parenthesis 0. So that's one of our answers. And then for the second one, we say, well, let me add 3. This is a two-step equation, and get 2x equals 3, and then divide by 2 and get x equals, well, I can't do anything with 3/2 other than write 3/2. So my other answer is 3/2. You can also write this as like -5 and 3/2 next to each other with just a single x, or there's some other different ways of writing the answer, but it has to be those two numbers. You couldn't get two other numbers for your answers. So that's the idea, is that we are going to do what we've been doing, which is factoring, but then once we have our problem factored, we're going to take each part of the problem and set it equal to 0 to finish and figure out what x actually equals. So let's start off with a fairly easy factoring problem. If there's nothing in front of n squared, then all we've got to do is split this up and decide what multiplies to get -18 that will add, or I guess subtract, to get -7. So again, if you don't think of it right away, make a list of the things that multiply to get 18, and then once you have that list, start thinking about, since this is negative, one of my numbers needs to be negative, so I need to subtract to get 7. That means I'm doing 2 and 9, and so I either need to do 2 minus 9, or I need to do -2 plus 9. Which of these is going to give me a -7? The first one, where the 9 is the negative number, which is bigger. So we're going to do +2 and -9, and this still equals 0. And now we're ready to say what n has to equal. So n plus 2 equals 0. We're going to solve that. And n minus 9 equals 0. We're going to solve that. So -2 and +9. And we get 9 and -2 as our answers. This one, okay, so just kind of to give you some steps, by the way. Step 1. The very first thing that we want to do in an equation like this is we want to make it to where that it is in standard form on one side. And not only that, we actually want x squared to be positive. And that's going to set us up to be able to factor most easily. So step 2 will be to factor, and then step 3 will be to solve. But that first step, if we don't do it right, is going to make the next step impossible in a lot of ways. So we want to move these so they're on the same side, and we want x squared to be positive, which means it's already where it needs to be. We need to add the 16x over here to the left side. So that I have, and those aren't like terms because I can't add x squareds and x's together. So I have 8x squared plus 16x equals 0. Now this is not a trinomial, so this is not where we would put 2 parentheses and try to split things up that way. What we want to do is, for one thing, we want to check and see, is there something I can divide both of these by? Because if I can, then that will help me out in the long run. I can actually divide them both by 2, by 4, or by 8, and so I want to do the biggest number, which is 8. And that leaves me with x squared plus 2x equals 0. 0 divided by 8 is still 0, which is why we're allowed to do that. If it didn't say equals 0, then we would have to rewrite this with the 8 outside to show that what we have is the same thing as what we started with. But because it's an equation, we're allowed to go ahead and divide everything by that number. What I'm not allowed to do in an equation is divide by a variable. And so if you're looking at this saying, well, oh, I could divide by an x, I'm not allowed to do that because I would end up with 0 for, actually there's a bunch of different reasons. Never mind, that's not really the reason at all. The reason that I can't divide by x in an equation is because if one of our answers is x equals 0, we're not allowed to divide by 0. And it makes it to where we think there's less answers than there really are. So just in general, don't divide by letters when you're solving an equation. What we want to do instead is we want to say, well, they do have an x in common that I can take out. And when I take it out, I do think about what it is whenever I divide by x to write what's inside, which is x plus 2. But this is the point where I say I have 2 things multiplied together that equal 0, so each of them have to equal 0. But the thing that's weird about that is that since this is just x, that means that x has to equal 0. And then we subtract 2 and get x equals -2. So those are our 2 answers. And just in general, whenever we have a problem like this where we had to take out an x to factor, like, we should end up with 0 as an answer every single time, because if we take out an x, I mean, that's just how that works. On this next one, so we need it all on the same side and in standard form. So we're going to, and we also want x squared to be positive. So even though it may seem less efficient, I'm going to move everything to the left. So it's going to come over to this side, and I want to put it in standard form. And right now I want to check and see, is there a number I can divide all of these by? And looks like I can do 2. But that's it. I can divide them all by 2. So that's going to give me 9x squared minus 24x plus 16 equals 0. So part of the frustrating thing about this is now any type of factoring we've done is fair game. So like the last one, we had to factor out the greatest common factor, which was the first thing that we talked about. The first example was the most recent thing we talked about. This is kind of somewhere in between, because you either need to use slide and divide, or we could use the pattern that we talked about, where we said if I can square root this and I can square root this, then I can write 3x and 4. And since this is negative, that would be negative, and we put a squared, and it equals 0. So if that's not something that you think you'll recognize, you would need to do slide and divide. So you'd slide the 9 over and multiply, and then keep going. I'm pretty sure we're going to slide and divide on the next one, so if you don't remember how to do that, that'll be a good reminder there. What happens here is what we're really getting two parentheses that are the same, that we could set either of them equal to 0 and solve, and we get the same thing for both of them. So this only has, or only appears to have, one answer because our answer is repeated. We get it twice. We get 4/3, but we get it multiple times here. And up here, if you wrote it like this, well, we could get rid of the squared by square rooting both sides, if you want to think of it like that, and say that it's really just 3x minus 4 equals 0. But our answer is 4/3. Okay, example 4. One of the things that can be toughest on problems like these is that they tend to make us have to remember all of our types of factoring, and that can be tricky because we might be used to seeing them all separately. So here we are solving by factoring, which means we need to be able to factor this, and my personal method of choice for factoring when there's something in front of b squared is called slide and divide, and I have other videos about that if you'd like to look at them, or I have a video at least. What we do is we take the number in front of b squared and we slide it over to the c term, if this is ax squared plus bx plus c, and we multiply them together. 3 times negative 16 is negative 48. Now at this point, I would not want to put equals 0 if I want to be completely mathematically correct, because these two things are not actually equal. What we're doing right now is kind of some side work to try to figure out what this factors into, and until we actually have it factored out, it's not equal to what we started with. So I'm going to leave off the equals 0. What I want to do is come up with what multiplies to get negative 48, that adds to get negative 8. So it may be that I can think of those factors right off the top of my head, or it may be helpful for me to make a list of factors. When I do that, I go really methodically through and say, let me start with 1 and pair it up with what it goes with. Let me go to 2 and figure out what 2 times what gives me 48. 3 times 16 gives me 48, which I know because that's how I got 48 in the first place. 4 times 12. And then you can stop when you get what you need, because if one of these is supposed to be negative to get negative 48, then I can use 4 and 12, because 4 minus 12 is negative 8. That means that the 12 needs to be negative to make my middle number negative, because when I add a positive and negative number, it gets the sign of whichever is bigger. It doesn't matter which order I put in the numbers in parentheses, but I'm going to put b plus 4 and b minus 12. The important thing about this method, slide and divide, is that now we have to divide by what we slid earlier, this 3. So if it divides, which this does not, when we go ahead and divide it, so it would be b minus 4, because 12 divided by 3 is 4. And if it doesn't divide, we take the bottom number and we move it in front. That's after we've simplified, if we can simplify. So 3b squared minus 8b minus 16 factors into this right here. This is where I can go back and put equals 0. And then to finish this off, we set each part equal to 0, each of our parentheses, and then solve. So on this first one, that means subtracting 4 and dividing by 3, like a normal two-step equation. It's just these two-step equations that we end up with when we slide and divide. We're going to end up with quite a few fractions, most likely. And then on here, we just have to add the 4 over and get b equals 4. So our two answers are 4 and negative 4/3. One more example. So remember that our first step is to get things in standard form, and that we want to make x squared, we want it to be positive. So one way to do that is to say, let me add all these terms to the other side. Another way to do it would be to say, let me divide everything by -1, which will change this to a positive. And that's the way I would like to do it. It doesn't matter if the 0 is on the left or on the right. It does matter that I want the 7x squared to be first, and then the 15x, and then the +2. And now I'm ready to slide and divide, because the 7 in front of x squared means that I have to do that, or I have to use some method. 7 times 2 is 14. I want to think about what multiplies to get 14 and adds to get 15. Since it's positive 14, they have to both be positive or both be negative. If I make my list over here, it should be pretty easy to see that 1 and 14 are what work. It can be difficult, however, it's really easy to forget that 1 and 14 is an option. So make sure that you keep that in the back of your head at all times, that 1 times whatever your number is a factor. We have to divide by the 7, so that gives us 7x plus 1 and x plus 2, because when it divides, we divide. When it doesn't, we move the bottom number in front of x. And then we're ready to solve by setting each parentheses equal to 0. So I subtract 1 and get 7x equals -1, and then divide by 7. And x equals -1/7. Then I subtract 2 and get x equals -2. So my two answers are -1/7 and -2. As a side note, you can check every single problem on here by going back and plugging in your answers for each of the x's. So if I wanted to do the easier one to check it, the -2 as opposed to the fraction, then I can say -2 plus 30. This is 4 times -7, which is -28. Does this side really equal 0? Yes, it does. So -2 really is an answer. I could do the same thing with the -1/7 if I really wanted to mess with fractions. And on a quiz or a test, that may be something that is a really good idea for you to do, is to check those. It might be easier, though, to check right here by foiling or distributing this out to make sure it really gives you what we had up here. So that would be another place that you could check so that you would be a little bit more sure that you were doing it right. So this has been how to solve quadratic equations by factoring.